This is the headline they tried to bury before the markets opened. For 60 years, the United States dollar has been the unchallenged king of global commerce. Every barrel of oil, every shipping container, every central bank reserve from Tokyo to Berlin. The dollar was gravity. It was the one thing every nation on earth agreed on. But this morning, Wednesday, March 4th, 2026, at approximately 6:15 a.m. Eastern Time, gravity just broke. Breaking news out of Paris has detonated a financial bomb that is sending shockwaves through every trading floor on the planet. French President Emmanuel Macron, standing at the Élysée Palace, flanked by the governors of the Banque de France and the European Central Bank, has formally announced that the Republic of France is initiating a full withdrawal from the U.S. dollar settlement system for all bilateral trade with non-NATO partners. This is not a symbolic gesture. This is not a policy proposal. This is an executive decree, signed, sealed, and effective in 90 days. France, the seventh largest economy on earth, a founding member of NATO, a nuclear power, and America's oldest ally, has just told the United States that its money is no longer welcome. As we speak, the euro is surging. Gold has spiked past $3,400 an ounce. The dollar index is in free fall, down 4.2% in pre-market trading, the largest single-session drop since the Nixon shock of 1971. Treasury yields are hemorrhaging. The Dow futures are pointing to an opening loss of over 1,100 points. We are talking about the end of dollar hegemony. We are talking about the fracturing of the Western alliance. We are talking about the beginning of a multipolar currency war that will reshape the global economy for the next century. In this special report, we are going to break down exactly why Macron pulled the trigger now. We are going to trace the financial plumbing that makes this so devastating. We are going to explain the $23 trillion nightmare scenario that the Federal Reserve is desperately trying to prevent. And we are going to answer the question that every American with a 401k, a pension, or a savings account needs to hear. What happens to your money when the world stops trusting the dollar? Buckle up. The post-war order is being dismantled in real time. To understand why France detonated this bomb today, you have to understand what happened over the last 11 months. It starts with tariffs. In April 2025, the administration imposed a new round of sweeping trade penalties on European goods. We are talking about a 25% tariff on French wine. We are talking about a 20% surcharge on German automobiles. We are talking about a 15% levy on Italian luxury goods. The official justification was trade imbalance correction. The real reason, according to leaked cables obtained by Le Monde, was punishment. France had refused to support the administration's Greenland acquisition strategy. Paris had publicly called it neo-colonialism. The tariffs were retaliation dressed up as economic policy. For months, the European Union tried to negotiate. Sources inside the EU Trade Commission say that Brussels offered 3 separate compromise packages between June and October 2025. Each one was rejected. The administration wanted total capitulation. They wanted Europe to fall in line on Greenland, on China policy, on NATO spending targets, on everything. The Europeans balked, and so the tariffs stayed and they metastasized. By November 2025, according to Eurostat data, French exports to the United States had fallen by $18.7 billion, a 31% collapse year over year. The French agricultural sector was hemorrhaging. Bordeaux wineries were laying off workers. Champagne houses were reporting the worst holiday season in 40 years. Macron's approval rating, according to IFOP polling from December, had cratered to 22%, the lowest of his presidency. But here is what nobody is talking about. The tariffs were only the fuse. The real detonator was the Japan bond crisis that erupted in January 2026. When the Japanese financial system imploded and the Bank of Japan was forced into emergency dollar liquidation, it exposed a terrifying vulnerability in the global reserve system. Japan, the largest foreign holder of U.S. Treasury bonds, dumped $340 billion in treasuries in a single week to shore up the yen. That fire sale crashed treasury prices and spiked yields to 5.8%, the highest since 2007. The message to every central bank on earth was clear. If you hold dollars, you are hostage to American chaos. Sources inside the Banque de France say that Governor François Villeroy de Galhau presented Macron with a classified briefing on January 28, 2026, 5 days after the Japan shock. The briefing, reportedly titled Dollar Dependency and Sovereign Risk, laid out a scenario in which a continued U.S. financial crisis could wipe $120 billion off France's reserve holdings in a matter of weeks. The recommendation was immediate diversification. Macron, already furious about the tariffs, already humiliated on the world stage, saw his opening. He didn't just want to diversify. He wanted to make a statement. He wanted to punish Washington the way Washington had punished Paris. The dollar withdrawal decree was drafted in secret over the following 5 weeks by a team of 12 economists and legal advisors inside the French Treasury. Let's get technical about what this decree actually does, because the mechanism is more devastating than the headline suggests. Under the current global trading system, approximately 58% of all international transactions are settled in US dollars. This is what economists call dollar hegemony, and it is the single greatest source of American financial power. When France buys oil from Saudi Arabia, it pays in dollars. When France sells Airbus jets to India, the contract is denominated in dollars. When French banks lend to African governments, the loans are structured in dollars. The decree changes all of this for non-NATO bilateral trade. Starting June 3rd, 2026, all French trade with China, India, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, South Africa, and 47 other nations will be settled in euros, the local partner currency, or gold. The dollar is cut out entirely. According to French Treasury estimates, this covers roughly $215 billion in annual trade flows. That is $215 billion that will no longer need to be converted through the U.S. banking system. That is $215 billion that will no longer generate demand for dollars on the foreign exchange markets. That is $215 billion in structural support for the dollar that simply evaporates overnight. But here's the catch, and this is what makes this a catastrophe rather than an inconvenience. France is not acting alone. Sources at the European Central Bank, speaking on condition of anonymity, have confirmed that Germany, Italy, and Spain have been briefed on the French decree and are expected to announce similar measures within 60 days. According to leaked minutes from an emergency Eurogroup meeting held on February 27, 2026, the 4 largest Eurozone economies have agreed in principle to a coordinated dollar exit for non-alliance trade. If all 4 nations follow through, the dollar loses settlement demand covering approximately $780 billion in annual trade. The data shows this is not a French tantrum. This is a European revolt. It gets worse. Behind the scenes, Beijing has been waiting for exactly this moment. Sources inside the People's Bank of China say that Governor Pan Gongsheng held a secure video conference with his French and German counterparts on Saturday, March 1st, 3 days before the announcement. The topic was the creation of a Euro-Yuan bilateral settlement corridor that would bypass the dollar entirely for Europe-China trade. That trade relationship is worth over $900 billion annually. If the corridor is established, combined with the French decree and its European copycats, we are looking at over $1.7 trillion in annual trade flows being ripped out of the dollar system within 18 months. For context, the entire U.S. federal budget deficit is approximately $1.9 trillion. The dollar demand destruction we are describing is almost equivalent to the annual borrowing needs of the United States government. This is where the situation escalates from financial crisis to existential threat. The United States funds its deficit by selling treasury bonds. Foreign governments and institutions buy those bonds because they need dollars to conduct trade. If the world needs fewer dollars, foreign demand for treasuries collapses. If treasury demand collapses, the U.S. government has to offer higher yields to attract buyers. Higher yields mean higher interest payments on the national debt, which is already $36.4 trillion. According to the Congressional Budget Office, every 1% increase in average borrowing costs adds approximately $360 billion in annual interest payments. The current budget already allocates $1.1 trillion to debt service. If borrowing costs spike by even 2% because of reduced dollar demand, annual interest payments would approach $1.8 trillion, consuming nearly 40% of all federal revenue. The government would be forced to choose between funding Social Security, funding the military, or paying the interest on its own debt. It cannot do all three. This is the fiscal death spiral that the Federal Reserve has nightmares about. And Macron just kicked open the door. Sources inside the West Wing described the mood as apocalyptic. The president was reportedly briefed at 5:45 a.m., 30 minutes before Macron went live. According to 2 senior officials who spoke on background, the president's initial reaction was to demand the immediate recall of the U.S. ambassador to France and the imposition of emergency sanctions on French financial institutions. The Secretary of the Treasury, reportedly ashen-faced, argued against sanctions, warning that punishing France would accelerate the European exit and potentially trigger a full-scale run on the dollar. The National Security Advisor, according to sources, framed the crisis in military terms, calling it a financial Pearl Harbor. The president reportedly responded by asking whether NATO Article 5 could be invoked against a member state for economic warfare. He was told no, there are no good options. Sanctioning France would prove Macron's point that dollar dependency is a weapon. Doing nothing signals weakness. Retaliating with more tariffs would accelerate the very decoupling the administration fears. The administration is trapped in a strategic kill box of its own construction. Every retaliatory move makes the crisis worse. This is the paradox of weaponized economics. When you turn your currency into a punishment, eventually the punished find another currency. Let's push this to the worst-case scenario because the dominoes are already falling. If the European dollar exit proceeds and China joins with a bilateral settlement corridor, the next shoe to drop is Saudi Arabia. Riyadh has been flirting with yuan-denominated oil sales since 2023. Sources close to the Saudi finance ministry say that Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman views the French decree as political cover. If France can leave the dollar system, so can the kingdom. The petrodollar, the cornerstone of American financial supremacy since 1974 when Kissinger struck the original deal with King Faisal, would be finished. If Saudi Arabia prices even 30% of its oil exports in non-dollar currencies, that removes roughly $120 billion in annual dollar demand. Combined with the European exit, we are now approaching $2 trillion in lost dollar demand annually. The cascading effect on treasury markets would be catastrophic. Yields could spike to 7% or higher. The housing market, already fragile from the Japan shock, would seize up entirely. Mortgage rates would breach 10%. The stock market, currently pricing in a soft landing, would face a correction of 30% to 40%. Your 401k, your pension fund, your retirement savings, eviscerated. And this is not some distant hypothetical. This is the trajectory we are on right now, today, as of 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time on March 4th, 2026, if this cascade is not stopped within the next 30 days. Here is the hidden connection that nobody in the mainstream financial press is discussing. The Japan crisis, the French decree, and the potential Saudi defection are not three separate crises. They are one crisis with three faces. The common thread is trust. Japan lost trust in the dollar's stability when the bond market convulsed. France lost trust in America as a reliable partner when the tariffs became punitive. Saudi Arabia is losing trust in American security guarantees as the administration pivots toward isolationism. The dollar's value was never just about economics. It was about faith. Faith that America would be a stable steward. Faith that the rules would be fair. Faith that holding dollars was safe. That faith is now hemorrhaging from three wounds simultaneously, and no amount of Federal Reserve intervention can stitch it back together. You cannot print trust. You cannot set an interest rate for credibility. What does this look like on Main Street? The average American is not tracking bilateral settlement corridors or Eurodollar liquidity pools, but they are about to feel it in ways that are immediate and brutal. When the dollar weakens, imports get more expensive. Every television, every phone, every car part, every piece of clothing manufactured overseas costs more. Inflation, which had been moderating toward 3.1% in January, is projected by Goldman Sachs to reaccelerate toward 5% to 6% by summer if the dollar decline continues. Gasoline prices, already elevated from Middle East instability, could breach $5 a gallon nationally. Grocery costs, which hit seniors and fixed-income households hardest, would spike. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, households earning under $50,000 spend 34% of their income on food and energy. A 20% increase in those costs pushes millions of families from discomfort into crisis. How does this play politically? The MAGA base sees this as betrayal by an ungrateful ally. France, the country America liberated on D-Day in 1944, is now stabbing us in the back. Expect rallies, expect calls to pull out of NATO entirely, expect boycotts of French wine that were already impossible to buy because of the tariffs. The anger is real and it is justified, but here is the fracture line. The donor class, the Wall Street Republicans, the hedge fund managers, and Fortune 500 CEOs, they see something different. They see an administration that provoked this crisis through reckless tariff policy and diplomatic incompetence. According to a leaked memo from a major Republican fundraising committee, 3 billionaire donors have suspended contributions pending a course correction on trade policy. The coalition is cracking. What does Putin think when he watches this unfold from the Kremlin? He sees the Western alliance fracturing along economic lines. He sees Europe building financial infrastructure that excludes America. He sees the dollar, the weapon that was used to sanction him after Ukraine, losing its teeth. If the dollar is no longer the world's reserve currency, sanctions become a rubber sword. Russia can trade in euros, in yuan, in gold. The economic wall that the West built around Moscow develops cracks wide enough to drive a tank through. Sources in Russian diplomatic circles describe the mood as celebratory. They are calling it the beginning of the end of American unilateral power. Xi Jinping sees something even more strategic. He sees the yuan gaining legitimacy as a settlement currency without China having to do anything provocative. France, a Western democracy, a nuclear-armed member of the UN Security Council, has voluntarily opened the door to yuan settlement. That is an endorsement that Beijing could never have bought or coerced. The internationalization of the yuan just leapt forward by a decade, and it was delivered as a gift by Emmanuel Macron. The irony is staggering. American trade policy, designed to constrain China, has just handed Beijing its greatest financial victory since joining the WTO in 2001. The Federal Reserve is now facing its own impossible dilemma. If the dollar keeps falling, the Fed could raise interest rates to defend the currency. But raising rates in the middle of a potential recession, with housing already frozen and consumer confidence at 2008 levels, would be economic suicide. It would crash the stock market, trigger mass layoffs, and push the economy into a depression. Alternatively, the Fed could let the dollar fall and accept higher inflation, which punishes savers and retirees and erodes the purchasing power of every American paycheck. There is no middle ground. The Fed is being forced to choose between defending the currency and defending the economy. It cannot do both. Chairman Powell, according to sources at the Federal Reserve Board, has requested an emergency meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee for Friday, March 6, 2026. The agenda has one item: dollar stabilization strategy. But the tools in the toolbox are rusted shut. History teaches us that reserve currencies do not die overnight. The British pound's decline took decades, from the humiliation at Suez in 1956 to the final unraveling in the 1970s when Britain went to the IMF with its hat in its hand. The Spanish real, the Dutch guilder, the French franc itself, each one fell not because of a single event, but because of an accumulation of arrogance, overreach, and the slow erosion of the confidence that underpinned them. What we are witnessing with the dollar may be the Suez moment. Not the death, but the diagnosis. The moment when the world looked at America and decided that the emperor had no clothes, that the dollar was backed not by strength, but by inertia, and that inertia had finally run out. The founders understood this. Alexander Hamilton built the American financial system on the principle that national credit was sacred, that the full faith and credit of the United States was worth more than gold because it was backed by the discipline and integrity of the Republic. What happens when that discipline collapses into tariff wars and diplomatic vendettas? What happens when that integrity is sacrificed for political vengeance against allies? The Constitution gave Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations. It did not give the executive the power to weaponize trade until allies become enemies. This is not just a financial crisis. This is the stress test of the American economic order. Can the dollar survive when the world no longer needs it? Can the republic survive when its own policies drive allies into the arms of adversaries? Can your retirement survive the crossfire? We are in uncharted waters. The maps that guided 70 years of American financial supremacy are burning. Let's talk about what happens to the average retiree if this plays out. A 67-year-old in Florida with $400,000 in a 401k, mostly invested in index funds and bonds, would see their portfolio lose between $120,000 and $160,000 in a 30-40% market correction. Their bond holdings, supposedly the safe portion, would lose value as yields spike and bond prices crash. Their Social Security check, adjusted annually for inflation using a formula that always lags actual price increases, would buy less every month. Their Medicare supplemental premiums would rise. Their property insurance, already devastated by the Florida crisis, would become unaffordable. This is not abstract economics. This is a person choosing between medication and groceries. This is the real cost of a trade war that turned into a currency war that turned into the potential collapse of the dollar-based financial order. As we head into the next 72 hours, watch for these signals. Watch the European Central Bank statement expected Thursday morning. If Christine Lagarde endorses the French position, the dollar sell-off accelerates into a rout. Watch the Saudi Foreign Ministry for any statement on oil pricing denominations. Watch the Chinese yuan exchange rate. If it strengthens past 6.8 to the dollar, Beijing is positioning for the corridor. Watch Treasury auctions next week. If foreign participation drops below 25%, the fiscal death spiral has begun. Watch your brokerage account. Watch your grocery bill. Watch the price of gasoline at the pump near your house. The consequences of this moment will not stay on trading floors and in diplomatic cables. They are coming for your kitchen table. For one nation that spent 80 years as the financial center of the world, this is the reckoning. The allies are leaving. The currency is weakening. The trust is broken. And the tariffs that were supposed to make America stronger have made the dollar weaker than at any point since the Bretton Woods Agreement was signed in 1944. The sheriff is not at the door this time. This time, the door has been removed from its hinges, and the neighbors are building their own house. France has fired the first shot in the currency war of the 21st century. The question is no longer whether the dollar system survives intact. The question is what replaces it, and whether America has any seat at the table when the new architecture is drawn. Subscribe, stay tuned. The financial architecture of the modern world is being rewritten this week, and you cannot afford to look away.